Okay, so we're alive. I don't know about you guys, but Hurricane Matthew kind of just took everything and just shook it and threw it. So, we're going to regroup a little bit. Now, I have a little bit of a game plan. As far as the resubmissions for paper 1, what I've decided to do is I've actually opened a new Dropbox that's just for revisions. It has unlimited time and unlimited submissions. So you should be able to put all your revisions there. So especially after I grade the next paper, make sure you're submitting all your revisions to that Dropbox, and I'll go back and revise the grade as they appear there. Golly, I haven't slept for like 3 days, so I'm going to be a little bit this time. I'm going to try to create a little... to try to catch up from where we are, because we are like ridiculously behind. I'm going to create at least 3 or 4 videos this week covering material, and I really want to try to get as much grading done as I can. So obviously, watch these at your leisure. Leisure. I think leisure sounds British and therefore more intelligent. Just to kind of move ahead, as far as a discussion question this week, I'll get to that on Tuesday because my brain just can't handle it today. The next video, also try to get this reading done in the next couple of days. It's not much. Emily Dickinson, let's do I Felt a Funeral in My Brain, and I Never Lost as Much But Twice. Those poems are fantastic, and that'll give me a break from some of this more technical stuff. So what I want to do today is I want to kind of lay some groundwork for what we're going to do with the final paper. What I've decided to do is I'm going to smash the final papers together into one, and it's going to be worth a lot of points. It's going to be 24 points, 6 to 8 pages, so it's going to have to be a longer thing. This paper is going to focus on literary theory. You're going to have to apply some literary theory to an American text in order to get the full credit for this. Now, so far, the only literary theory we've covered, I believe we've covered a little bit of psychoanalysis, where you're trying to figure out what's wrong with a person and trying to diagnose them and all the crazy stuff that's implied with that. We've covered New Historicism a lot. New Historicism, like I've said a million times, is my primary way of looking at literature. When you look at an author's life and their experience, you try to figure out what it was exactly they had in their mind when they wrote something. And I think we may have talked a little bit about feminism. I should probably write that down. Feminism is extremely important, so we might need to go over that. Today we're going to talk about, and I'm actually going to do these, I think I'm going to devote a whole video just to a discussion of this particular theory. Let's do Marxism. Somewhere Glenn Beck's head is exploding. But Marxism, a lot of people when they hear about Marxism, they get really up in arms about it, and I understand it because Marx wasn't the kind of guy to mince words, and a lot of his theory was applied to revolutionary language. Marx basically threw Europe into chaos for a little while, although the fascists did as well. But Marx gave birth to the ideological foundation of communism, which would later become, in an offshoot, socialism. A lot of people use these things interchangeably. Now, I know what you're thinking, Mr. Bailey, this is a literature class, right? Why are you talking about politics? Well, this is actually kind of important because literature does not exist in a vacuum the way math does. I'm going to pick on math because math people are lame. But literature is, in and of itself, reliant on the stuff that you bring to it and what's going on in the environment in which it's created. We don't necessarily have to do a lot of New Historicism for this, but it is kind of part and parcel. Marxism also has a really weird relationship with New Historicism. I know what you're thinking, Mr. Bailey, please, for God's sake, get to the point. Basically, let me give you a quick summary of what Marx said and why it's important for literature. Marx basically, man, I could do an hour-long video on this crap. I got to try to think hard to give you the truncated version. Marx read a lot of philosophers that came before him. He was a big fan of Wilhelm Hegel. Don't read Wilhelm Hegel. I love Hegel, but geez, he'll make your head explode like Glenn Beck's. But Hegel had this really weird theory of history called the dialectic. You don't necessarily have to know this for this class, but it is kind of interesting. Hegel believed that history existed mainly in what we call thesis, antithesis, and that became synthesis. History basically played out in conflicts, and conflicts eventually were force resolved, and what came out of that conflict was the synthesis. Like, I'll give you kind of a weird Hegelian example of this, although it's kind of hard to do it perfectly because Hegel kind of oversimplified things. But let's talk about America and Britain, right? We had the British colonies, and this is actually pretty good for an American context as well. We had the British colonies here. Eventually, the nation that would become America rebelled and began a revolution to try to separate themselves from Britain. This is the classic thesis, would probably be Britain in this case, because Britain is much more established than America was at this point. And the antithesis was America and the American revolutionaries. We fought a war, a bunch of people died, and eventually the synthesis was the independent America. But what's interesting for this, and one of the things that Hegel says, is that the synthesis is typically not the complete elimination of the thesis. I know you're rolling your eyes, I'm really going on and on about this. It's not the complete elimination of the thesis, but it is a true synthesis. There are bits of the thesis left after the conflict is resolved. So we have a strong American nation and, still a British nation, and now we're allied, and we're really closely allied. So that's a synthesis. Now, what Marx did, can I keep an eye on my time? What Marx did is he suggested that all of history plays out in a Hegelian dialectic. There's antithesis, there's thesis, synthesis. Everything is like boiling down to very, very basic conflicts and kind of working its way towards an ultimate conclusion. Hegel was very, very religious. Marx was not. What Marx said was that all of human history can be boiled down to basic class conflict, meaning that you have to be really careful about the words I use here because I want to be accurate, but I also don't want to invite rage, because this theory is extremely controversial. But you have a ruling class that has all the resources, and then you have a massive underclass that serves that ruling class. This is the thesis and the antithesis, and you have a constant process of revolution where what Marx called, and this was kind of like what he was using to describe his day and his particular time period, the proletariat. The proletariat are the skilled tradesmen, people who actually go out and work and do things and make things. The proletariat versus what he called the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie, for him, that's kind of a French term, were the people who were on top. They were the aristocrats. They were the nobility. They were all the people who owned everything and everybody worked for them. Now, in a lot of ways, you can still kind of see this today. We have people who own all of the capital, and then you have everybody else that's just kind of marching towards a kind of weird economic progression. But Marx came in and he challenged this. And he said that basically, if all of history is a dialectic, if it is a system of thesis versus antithesis, forming synthesis, then you're going to have a constant conflict between these classes where they constantly rise up and overthrow the people who are controlling them. Now, this is why people get uncomfortable with Marx. Marx in his theory was suggesting revolution, typically armed revolution. And so for a Marxist literary theory, what you're basically looking for is the constant use of class symbols. And you're looking for a kind of Marxist process to say, yeah, that's still ongoing. Now, to kind of really put myself on the chopping block, I actually really like Marxism. I mean, not from a really ideological standpoint, but a lot of its insights and a lot of the things that it describes hold up kind of well, but not necessarily because we should be going in an armed revolution, but he does kind of lock on to some basics of human existence. The fact is that many of us belong to some type of social, economic class. And we have a lot of rules for our behavior based upon that economic class. Now, for Marx, again, Violence was the only answer to this in a lot of ways. For Marx also, this is interesting. Marx believed that you had to have a totalitarian government in order to completely eradicate the bourgeoisie. That the nobles and the rich and the capitalists, as they were called at that point, the people who owned basically everything, the only way that you could completely overthrow them would be to use the power of the state. That's why Marxism has a really weird tendency to lead towards dictatorship. That a lot of communist countries eventually end up dictatorships where a person has most of the power because he's supposed to be wielding the power of the state to destroy the bourgeoisie. So, politically, Marxist theories are a disaster. They end up causing all sorts of suffering. The same way that fascism does. Well, man, I really wish I could talk more about politics in this class because politics is awesome. So, as a literary theorist that is using a Marxist approach, and keep in mind, we're not necessarily arguing that Marx was right when we use a Marxist approach. We're simply using a Marxist approach. That can imply that the author intentionally was showing a Marxist theme, or that they were unconsciously channeling some of the things that Marx noticed about human history. Now, again, Marx, he oversimplified things, but that's convenient for us because it kind of gives us a direction with which to access literature. Let's take an example. Sleepy Hollow. When you look at Sleepy Hollow, there is a clear class distinction there, and it might not necessarily be where you think it is. The people of Sleepy Hollow are regular town folk. They go about their lives. They're not necessarily, this is going to sound derogatory, but they're not necessarily smart. They don't have to be. They are there to fulfill a function, to live their lives, to build their farms, and to do what they need to do, right? That's Brom Bones. That's Katrina Van Tassel. Although the Van Tassels are interesting because they're kind of up on a higher strata, because everybody wants to marry Katrina Van Tassel because, if I remember correctly, her father's rich. But Ichabod Crane is a really big outsider, even beyond the Van Tassels, because he's from the city. Because I think he's from New York, right? He's a constable. He's educated. He's hyper-educated. And all of a sudden, he's going into this small town with a whole bunch of people who aren't hyper-educated. Now, this is the real genius of this story, because oftentimes we think of stories like Sleepy Hollow, we're supposed to think of the school teacher, the over-educated person, is supposed to be the know-it-all, right? Supposed to know everything. He's a freaking moron, right? He's an idiot. He's awkward and he's weird, and he doesn't know how ridiculous he is. His education has separated himself from everybody in his community. It's made him kind of a pariah. He doesn't even know it. In this case, the class system is very, very much in place from a Marxist standpoint. But what you have is actually something that's a little bit less revolutionary and more lighthearted. Ichabod Crane, they get rid of him by scaring him away, right? In this way, Sleepy Hollow is kind of like this weird sort of miniature Marxist revolution, because the townspeople are rising up against Crane as a symbol for these hyper-educated morons who come out of the city. Now, and the thing that I actually really like about this theory is the idea that for Katrina Van Tassel and the Van Tassels as well, they're not bad people. They are the leaders of the community. They are the richest people in town. But they're rich, and they still fit into their community. They're probably not as rich as the environment with which Ichabod Crane comes from. And they're probably also not quite as educated as he is. But they fit into their community better. This is a Marxist kind of look at how communities organize themselves and how they basically keep the intruder out. Think about that. If you want to do a Marxist reading of a piece, you got to look for the classes. Who's rich? Who's poor? Who's fighting who? What's at stake? Keep that in mind. We'll keep developing this later. Adios.